So Unit 5, memory retrieval, this is where we left off last. We were talking about the two parts of retrieval, which are recall and recognition. Can anyone tell me what recall is? No Wellness Wednesday anymore. I may bring it back, but we are on track with our pacing guide right now. So we'll see how that fits in, especially if I'm teaching, for hours in world history class and my voice hurts too much to talk. So we'll talk about that as we go on. That's a good question. Can anyone tell me what recall is? It's remembering a certain thing or event. Okay, without any hints in front of you. There's nothing in front of you saying, oh yeah, this is what you're supposed to be answering, which is different from recognition, because recognition is just being able to recognize something that you've already learned or you've already done. Okay, so recall is a measure of memory where you have to retrieve the information that you have previously learned, but you don't have any hints or anything priming you to that. Okay, so you can't guess. Okay, you can't do process of elimination. You have to purely know it. And so this is the more difficult form of retrieval. Okay, so an example of that for us would be our FRQs or our essays. When you get an FRQ question or when you get an LEQ prompt, for instance, you don't have anything there to help you answer that question. If it asks, what were some of the causes and effects of the Columbian Exchange on the Americas? Okay, you don't have documents or anything to tell you, okay, yeah, there was the encomienda, there was smallpox, there was the, I'm trying to think of the asiento, the encomienda, all of that stuff, right? You have to simply be able to pull it out of thin air or really out of your long-term memory storage. Okay, that's different from recognition, which is just identifying the correct answer. So like with multiple choice, you can eliminate wrong answers and guess between A and B or between C and D. I don't know if y'all's generation remembers this show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which is a trick question. Everyone wants to be a millionaire, but it's kind of like the predecessor to Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? And with this, they would ask questions and it would all be multiple choice, right? But hardly anyone ever won $1 million because you still only have a 25% chance of getting it right just purely by guessing, which is still better than if you had to come up with the answer like Scholars Bowl and just blurt it out. So does anyone know the answer to this question? A number 1 followed by 100 zeros is known as what? And don't say Jeff Bezos' net worth. It is a Google. Good. Okay, so that's where we get the term for Google for our search engine because of how many search results you can get back if you just put in one word or something. Like if you put in like pressure washing videos, which is, we should watch that for Wellness Wednesday. You'll get a bunch of quote unquote hits. Okay, maybe even a Google's worth. Are we good so far? So if recall is harder than recognition, how do we make our brain get that information out when we're tested on it or when we're quizzed on it? Well, sometimes we can be primed, we can be activated before the actual event. And this often occurs unconsciously. So you're making particular associations based on things that you already know. So say for instance, top-down processing. Y'all may remember that top-down processing is when you start with a bigger idea and then you base that experience or you use that experience to base what you do next. The opposite of that is bottom-up processing, where you start purely with what you sense. Okay, so if you're looking at these examples, these pictures, you see this picture here. Okay, and if you're thinking of bottom-up processing, you're just like, okay, so it's furry, it's got big ears, it's got a cute little nose, it's got 4 paws. That's your bottom up processing. You're just taking in the visual information. Whereas idea, okay, you may say this and see this and think, oh, rabbit, and that makes me think of Winnie the Pooh. Or, oh, rabbit, that's really delicious. Or maybe you don't think it's delicious because you're like, no, bunnies are supposed to be pets, right? If you look at this roll of money, okay, which is more money than I've ever had in my entire life, this strap of just hundreds of bills, right? You may think, okay, it has the word 100. It is green. There's a rubber band around it. That is bottom up processing. You're just taking in the sensory information. Whereas top down, if you think about the idea of money, Like, oh, we can exchange money for goods and services. Or you might think the stimulus bill going through Congress, right? Or you may think about where you put your money, whether it's in a wallet or if you don't use actual money and instead you use like credit cards, right? So this is acting as a primer for other associations for other words. So you could use like a mnemonic device of, oh, I'm remembering that another name for a rabbit is hare, H-A-R-E, versus hair as in the hair on your head. Or you may remember, oh, this is the name of the river, okay, because you're thinking bank, money, and the bank of a river. Okay, so you're using those associations to kind of prime what word comes next. Does that make sense? So for instance, if you ask a teacher for help on a test and you're like, okay, so I don't get what this question is saying. Okay, they might inadvertently give you the answer just by trying to explain what the question is asking because they're priming you for answer B over answer C, which is why in the AP exam and ACT, you're not supposed to have people answering questions like that for you. Okay, so in addition to priming, some other retrieval cues or associations that can be helpful if you're trying to recall information includes context-dependent memory. Now, y'all may remember contextualization from your AP history classes, meaning the environment. Okay, so this is basically saying your environment can affect your memory. Do you have context effects for your memory retrieval? So the definition for context-dependent memory is information that is better retrieved in the context, meaning environment, in which it was encoded and stored, which is just a fancy way of saying learned. Okay, so if I am teaching you about psychology, right, and then I give you your tests here in the classroom, you're more likely to recall that information because you're in the same room in which you learned it. Those of you who are learning virtually, if you learn from these classes in your bedroom at a desk, you're more likely to do better on the test and remember that information because you're taking the test in the exact same context and the exact same environment in which you learned the material. Okay, so some drawbacks to this. If you're taking an AP exam, do y'all take the AP exam in the class in which you first learned the material? No, you do not. You take it in the gym. The ACT, do you take it in the class where you had your ACT class? No. Okay, you take it at a university or at another center that they've established as a testing center for the ACT. So you're put in a new environment, so you can't get that context in order to do better on the exam, okay? Also, with context effects, we use that to fill in the information. So this is another example of top-down processing. We're not just looking at what we can see objectively, we're filling in the blanks with information that we already know. For instance, everyone should know their alphabet, right? If we look at R blank A D, okay, we know that there's only one letter in the alphabet that can fit here that's being obscured. Which letter is that? E. Exactly. Okay, but does it necessarily have to be the letter E that's here? No. What other letter could fit here? Right? It wouldn't make any sense reading a word, but it would fit there structurally. Yeah, it would be F. But RFAD isn't a thing. And so our brain using top-down processing is like, yeah, no, that's probably not the letter that is put there. Okay, also in terms of context, the direction in which we read, we typically read from left to right. So if we see this, we're going to interpret this middle letter as the letter B, as opposed to if we're reading from the top to the bottom, we'll see 12, 13, 14. Now, if you're looking at this letter, or as this as a letter rather than a number, instead of seeing the number 12, you'd see the letter R. So the environment around those numbers and letters determine what you see. In fact, I almost lost out on my last apartment deposit because the person who was writing the check thought that I had written apartment 13 instead of apartment B. Okay, so I waited a month and I was like, where's my money? And then they had to resend the whole thing because that context dependent. They couldn't read my handwriting. Okay, how many of you have ever entered into a room to do something? You're on a mission, but then you get interrupted and you forget why you walked into that room. So I walk into the bathroom and I'm like, did I need to pee? Or was I here to brush my teeth? I don't remember. Okay, so how do you trigger that memory? How do you prime that based on your context? Well, you go back to the room that you had just left. You stand in the room and you look around and you're like, okay, what did I need from this room? Or what did I think? Or what was I doing when I left this room to go to the bathroom? Was I looking for my hairbrush? Was I going to wash my hands? And that can help trigger your memory. Okay, another association cue that we have is called the TOT phenomenon. Phenomenon is such a fun word to spell. Is that an M? No, it's an N. Phenomenon. The TOT phenomenon is the tip of the tongue phenomenon. How many of you have ever been talking to somebody and you're like trying to describe something, but you can't think of the name or can't think of the right word? Like the other day I was talking to my roommate and I was like, okay, it's that movie where I was explaining why I don't drive behind trucks that have like wood or poles or something, you know, like trees in the back of the truck. Because I was like, I saw this movie when I was younger. Is the movie where all those people died? And he's like, well, that doesn't help me at all. Like, what movie are you talking about? So it's at the tip of my tongue. I couldn't remember. What is the movie where the lady was riding behind a truck and there's a bunch of trees in it, and then the truck stopped suddenly and then the trees came shooting out the back of the truck and they impaled her? Yeah, Arlesia, it was Final Destination. Right? It was one of the, like, I think there's 13 of them or something. There's like a whole series, right? It was number 3. Ooh, okay, Joe. Joe's coming in with the facts. Oh, it was Terrence. Oh, I'm sorry. So I can see you through here. You're fine. So yeah, Final Destination. I think they came out with a more recent one that I actually saw in theaters. There was a bunch of like kids y'all's age going on a roller coaster. But anyway, so I couldn't for the life of me remember that. Okay, that is tip of the tongue phenomenon. And that happens a lot when you're taking a test, for instance. This feeling that information is stored in the memory, but you cannot readily retrieve it. Or you may like be going to bed that night and then all of a sudden you're like, Final Destination. I finally figured out what it was, or it comes to you in a dream. Okay, that's tip of the tongue phenomenon. Again, definition being the feeling that information is stored in the memory, but you cannot readily retrieve it. Okay, are we good so far? All right, you can also have the effects of emotions or your mood on memory. So state-dependent memory is when you're able to retrieve information if you're in the same state in which you encoded it. So if any of you have ever been given mints or chewing gum by your teacher before a test, I think I used to do that with y'all when you were freshmen. The trick behind that is if you study while eating mints or something that's mint flavored, right? And then you do that same thing when you take the actual test, that's going to take you back into that context. So it's going to be dependent on the state in which you learn the material. Or if you are learning math and you're really angry because math, okay, I'm very angry when I have to do math because I'm not very good at it. Okay, if you learned that material, like your multiplication tables while you're super angry, and then you take the test and you're super angry, then you're more likely to remember the information. In terms of movies, there was this movie a long time ago. Y'all are too young to watch it because it's rated R. But it's like Beer Fest or something, where the whole premise was they have to go into this like beer drinking competition in Germany of all places. And they couldn't find the secret location to where it was being held because the last time that they had gone to it, they had been, you know, intoxicated. And so they're all trying to plan, like, how do we find the entrance to the competition? We can't remember where it was. And so they come up with, oh, we're going to use state dependent memory, although they didn't say it that intelligently. They're like, okay, we were drunk the last time that we found it. So that must mean we need to be intoxicated in order to find it again. And so lo and behold, in the movie, that was part of the plot line where they actually got to the competition through using state dependent memory. Okay, so information is more easily recalled or retrieved if you're in the same state in which you learned it. Okay, that's a little bit different from mood congruent memory. Mood congruent memory is your tendency to recall experiences when you're in a certain mood or when you're in your feelings, right? But the mood has to be genuine. Okay, so how many of you have ever been like really sad, the big sad hits, and you have a playlist that's full of sad music, right? Well, if you're listening to that sad music, you're more likely to continue that cycle of sadness because that sad music is going to trigger a memory, all right, typically of sad events. And so it's going to create this spiral effect. So if you're feeling down, it would be better for you to watch a comedy. It would be better for you to listen to a happy playlist so that this mood congruent memory doesn't get triggered, that you don't start remembering things that just bring you further and further down. Does that make sense so far? All right. So how do we know so much information about memory and how we learn and how we forget? Well, that's due to our main man, Herman with two N's, Ebbinghaus. Okay, so he researched how much information we could store in our verbal memory. But in addition to just studying how extensive our verbal memory could be in terms of long-term memory, he also wanted to study the process of learning. Okay, how much do we retain over time? How much do we have to practice in order to increase our retention? And how much do we forget over a period of time? And so in order to do this objectively, he had to find a way to study memory that people wouldn't have an advantage over. Okay, so if he was like, okay, I'm going to make people memorize the periodic table. Well, if you got people in his study that were scientists, well, they would have an unfair advantage because they've already studied that before. And so they're more likely to recall it accurately. So he had to make up stuff. Okay, so he made up strings of syllables of approximately 3 letters like jif, fub, jocks, zir, okay, in order to get them to remember those strings of nonsense syllables or phonemes in order to study how quickly people learned them and how quickly they forgot them. Okay, so here are some of the results from his findings. Number one, practice is the best way to retain information. You need to rehearse over and over and over again. The more you rehearse, the longer it stays in your memory. Overlearning something increases your retention of that information. For instance, if I were to give y'all a test, let's pretend you're in my AP World History class, and I told you tomorrow we're going to have a test that's an LEQ. How hard are you going to study that material? If I'm like, okay, period 2, Columbian Exchange, essay tomorrow. Are y'all just going to study like vocabulary terms and that be it? No, some of y'all are like, yeah, no, probably I would. Alicia says in the chat, I would study very hard. You might read the chapter multiple times. You might make charts of causation versus continuity versus context and comparison. Okay, you want to make sure that you know all the information that we've covered frontwards and backwards and sideways and upside down, right? Well, then what if the next day instead of an LEQ test, I gave you a multiple choice test? Okay, you would do really, really well on that multiple choice test because you studied for a much harder test. You studied for a recall test, and then I gave you a recognition test. Okay, so if you study for every multiple choice test like you're studying for an essay, you are over learning, and that's going to increase your retention. You're more likely to do better on that multiple choice test as a result. Okay, so that's why they say that you should distribute your practice. Distributed practice is better than cramming. Okay, if you wait until the night before the test and you stay up till 3 a.m. trying to memorize everything that's in your book or memorize all your ID terms, that's not going to be nearly as effective as if you just spent 15 minutes a day going over your vocabulary terms or just skimming through your notes that you took that day in class. Okay, so the spacing effect is that finding that it is better for you to study a little over a longer period of time than it is for you to study a lot in a short period of time, which is why most AP classes are a year long. They don't just say, okay, the month before the exam, here's a review book, get cracking. Okay, you're supposed to build on those skills slowly over time over the course of a year. Although AP psychology, they sometimes make it a semester course, but I wouldn't do it if it were a semester course. It would cut out all the fun stuff of psychology and make it more stringent. Okay, so better than cramming or a mass study by using the spacing effect, that supports the idea that distributed practice is more effective. Okay, Ebbinghaus also discovered the concept of the learning curve and the forgetting curve. The learning curve is that the first time you learn something, it takes you a little bit longer than somebody who's already learned it before. Okay, so let's say right now, I don't know all my multiplication tables off the top of my head. It's been a minute, right? So if I was to study for a test on multiplication, it might not take me that long to study for the material. It might take 30 minutes before I'm like, okay, yeah, it's coming back to me. 9 times 9 is 18. Or no, sorry, wrong. 9 times 2 is 18. See, I need to practice probably longer than anybody else. So because I've already learned not multiple choice, multiplication tables, I might only have to study for like 30 minutes or an hour before I can take the test, and it's like, bam, done. But what if you're giving that same test to a second grader, right? And that second grader doesn't know any of their multiplication tables. They just know addition and subtraction. Well, then it might take them weeks to work through all of the different types of multiplication. First, it's the ones table. That's easy, right? Then there's the 2. Okay, you just double it. Then there's the 3. Then it gets a little bit more difficult, right? Okay, so it would take them longer to study for that exact same test because their learning curve is steeper. They've never learned it before. And the more difficult a topic is, the steeper that learning curve. Like y'all, physics has a steep learning curve. Okay, not everybody. Eli's just like, yes, at least in my experience with physics, because I took it when I was my senior year, and I was telling Micaiah earlier today that I would bring a blanket to school every day my senior year because I would be napping in physics because I already knew it was like, it's game over. Like I'll do the web quest, I'll do my best on the test, but it's literally all Greek to me. Like iota, whatever. Okay, delta. There's no other doing. You just do it to survive.
Yeah, just give it to God.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
After that.
Yeah, I do that too. It's like let go and let God. Like my locus of control, that's one of your vocab words, is like, yeah, I'm just gonna leave it. I'm gonna leave it to the powers that be, because I feel like the less I'm involved, the better things go. Right. So I made it out. I made like an A one semester and a B the other semester, but like only by the grace of God, go I. So this learning curve is like, yeah, it's very, very steep. Whereas let's say riding a bike, learning how to ride a bike, that's not a very steep learning curve. So many people do it. Right? What's something else that has a very low learning curve? Do y'all have any examples of something that you just pick up easily? Like, is TikTok easy? Because I know it's got all this editing software, but I'm so old, I think I would break it. Did y'all hear that TikTok banned the president? Which I mean, not to get political. It's not like a political thing. I just think it's like a little ironic because the shoe was on the other foot, where it was like, okay, this administration tried to ban TikTok, and then you get a twist at the end. Come on, y'all. What's an example of a learning curve that's very low? Writing. Okay, so like learning to write your letters. Maybe cursive is a steeper learning curve than writing in just regular print. Okay, typing. Did y'all ever have to take a typing class, or did you just do it? Terrence says he did. You just did it? Yeah, because when y'all are growing up, you had computers. I didn't have computers growing up. I had to take a literal typing class where they covered my keyboard with a little orange covering. And then the people before me, they learned on typewriters, okay? Someone said eating. Eating has a very low, that's literally an instinct. When a baby is born, they have an instinct, a rooting instinct, it's called, to go to the breast for breastfeeding. Okay, so yeah, that's a very, very low learning curve because it's instinctual. Okay, good. The forgetting curve is the idea of how much you forget over a period of time. And Ebbinghaus found that the steepest forgetting curve was the day after learning. Okay, let's say that the day of, you're given your multiplication tables and you're learning it for the first time as a second grader, and you learn 100%. on day 1. Okay, well, by day 2, you will have forgotten a majority of it. By day 2, when they test you on it, you'll only remember 40% of that information. So very, very steep learning curve. So you might think, forgetting curve. You might think, with this forgetting curve, that means by day 3 we'll be at 0 because 40 minus 60 is negative 20. You'll have even less knowledge than you had before. Well, no, that's not how it works. Whereas the first day, there's a very steep forgetting curve. That forgetting curve like balances out. So on day 3, or day 10 or day 50, you're still somewhere close to the 40% mark. Okay, but if you learn the information over and over and over again, then that forgetting curve gets smaller and smaller, which is why, by junior year, you should be super familiar with John Locke and the Enlightenment or the Columbian Exchange, because you've covered that. Some of y'all are laughing like, who's that? Who's she? Natural rights, what are those? So you should be very familiar with those concepts because you learn them freshman year, you learn them sophomore year, and then you're going to learn them again with Mr. Farquhar junior year. Okay, so the forgetting curve for that particular information is not very high, okay, because you've learned it so many times. So with the forgetting curve, this is the idea that immediately after you learn information the next day, you lose a lot of that information. Information retention drops to only about 40%. However, this loss slows down after the initial drop. So it doesn't mean like by day 3, you've forgotten literally everything. It slows down after that. And you can build it back up by relearning the information. Again, practice makes perfect. You forget less and less the more you rehearse that information. Are we good so far? All right. We've already talked about the serial position effect when we talked about the first items in the list and the last items in the list get remembered better than the others. All right, so this is called the primacy effect. The primacy effect is when you learn the first items, okay? And then the recency effect is when you only remember the most recent items, okay? This in the middle, not a lot of retention. So say, for instance, presidents. Go ahead and start listing the presidents in order in the chat. Who's number 1? Washington. Good. George Washington. Who came after George Washington? John Adams. Who's after John Adams? Some of you are like, Hamilton helped me with this. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson. Who's after Thomas Jefferson? James Madison, his BFF. Who's after James Madison? Tip of the tongue phenomenon right there. Yes, the men. They're all men. The white man. Oh, okay.
No, I did this in stats last year. I got us up at the test one day. I named all the presidents in order. And now I don't know who number 5 is.
I believe it starts with a J. John Quincy Adams.
I thought he was 6.
Was he 6? He was number 5.
6 is Martin Van Buren.
No.
Yes.
Wait. No, Jackson comes before Martin Van Buren.
No, Jackson was 7. Because
it was John Quincy Adams. You Google it right now. That's why we need Google. Okay. 6 president. Monroe. Trey says Monroe. I think it is Monroe. Is it Monroe?
It's John Quincy Adams.
John Quincy Adams. Okay. Who's after John Quincy Adams?
That's
Andrew Jackson. And then it's Martin Van Buren.
Okay.
Yeah, because he's a little magician. He's like, yeah, let's go toe to toe with the history teacher. I don't teach AP US history. Jackson was my period though. That was the period I did the best in Baker's class. Then the people in the middle, who that don't know them. Yeah, those. What about the people at the end? Who's our most recent president? Are you talking about president-elect or?
No, I mean like the one that.
Yeah. All right. Trump. Okay. Before Trump was Obama. Who's before Obama? George Bush, baby Bush. Who was before baby Bush? Clinton. Who was before Clinton? Daddy Bush. That's right. And then who was before him? Reagan. Good. Y'all are doing better than 6th period. Who's before Reagan?
Reagan before Reagan. No. Carter.
No. Carter. Okay. Who's before Carter? No.
Yes.
No,
Ford.
Ford. Yeah, because the whole resignation thing, Watergate. Then before him was Nixon. And then who was before Nixon? Matt, you are killing it. Who's before? You're undermining the recency effect. Okay, who's before Johnson? All right, before John F. Kennedy. Okay, before Eisenhower. Okay, good. Before Truman. Before Roosevelt.
The man.
Yes, the white man we've established.
Herbert Hoover.
Herbert Hoover, yeah, because the Depression. Who's before Hoover? Coolidge. Coolidge was cool. Who was before Coolidge?
Harding.
Martin who?
No, I said Harding.
Oh, Harding. Okay. All right. So Terrence is undermining the recency effect. But for the rest of y'all, you're like, okay, I know Abraham Lincoln's in there somewhere. Okay. But for the ones in the middle, we don't recall very well. We typically recall like first five, last five, and then everything in the middle is a crapshoot. Okay. Now, if you're ever on Jeopardy, Terrence, and they're just like, I'll take presidents for 500, I think you'll have it. You should just put that on the next test. I'll be like, that's the FRQ. Name the first 5 presidents. And you're like, Google. All right, so primacy effect is how we explain the serial position effect and remembering the first items in the list. Recency effect is the items that we've seen most recently. Again, the middle is forgotten the most often. Now, relearning, that's exactly what it sounds like. Relearning is information that we already knew. Okay, so y'all may have remembered, oh yeah, Eisenhower, and then the Great Depression, there's Hoover. You may remember hearing all those names and you'll be able to put them in order. Okay, or you may forget like, oh yeah, there was Clinton in the middle there, and then who was before him, right? The savings score is the idea that it takes less time to relearn old information that you've already come into contact with, whereas the first time learning was more time consuming. Okay, so your savings scores, junior year, if you've already learned about old imperialism and new imperialism and the Enlightenment, then by the time Mr. Farquhar goes over at junior year, you're gonna be like, oh yeah, life, liberty, the property, then later Thomas Jefferson, pursuit of happiness, all of that stuff. Okay, you won't have to spend, say, a month on that chapter. You may only have to spend a week on that chapter because you have a higher savings score. Whereas your freshman year, we had to slow it down, right? We had to go over the basics. We started with fire as technology and the Neolithic Revolution, right? And so it took y'all a lot longer to learn that information freshman year because you hadn't been exposed to it before. Unless, like, of course, you've seen the movie 300, and then you're just like, yeah, that's pretty much all we need to know about the Spartans, right? So if you've already, say, learned this material for Unit 5 because you've already done your Smart Book assignments, okay, those 2 that you have, then you're more likely to remember this information come test day because you've come into contact with it first through reading about it. Then you come into contact with it second through the lecture. Then you're coming into contact with it again through doing your ID terms. Okay, so look at how we're doing this distributed practice, not just for Unit 5, but also for Unit 4. I don't just give y'all a lecture and then say, okay, by this day you have to take the test. You have little assignments, little minor grades that scaffold you up to the test. So you've already practiced that material, like with your quiz yesterday or your ID terms that are due today. Okay, so I'm increasing y'all's savings score by having you do this work outside of class and then come to class for the material. Or if you're listening to the video after it's been recorded, then you're going to have a higher savings score. Does that make sense so far? All right. So quick review. In the chat, define recognition. You can hear furious typing. Having seen something before, so it is familiar. Good. When you recognize something from prior experience, shallow processing, like multiple choice questions. Good, Lucy. Okay, so recognition is shallow processing. You're just being able to recognize something from a prior experience because it is familiar. What is recall? When you retrieve information that you've previously learned and you don't have anything in front of you to recognize it. So like an FRQ, and it is more difficult than recognition. Okay, so recall is more difficult than recognition. Excellent. All right, so now we're going to do a broader review. So we're going to do a review of units that we've already covered and then see what our saving score is for that. So in the chat, go ahead and number the answer. So say you're answering number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and answer each of these questions. Number 1, what part of the brain is known as the reward center? That comes from the unit on the brain and the parts of the brain. 2, what is the difference between bottom up and top down processing? That comes from unit 3 with sensory and sensation and perception. 3, which neurotransmitter mimics endorphins versus which drug mimics endorphins? So you have the neurotransmitter and the drug. And then number 4, which psychologist is associated with structuralism, the structures of consciousness, the parts, versus who is associated with functionalism, the function of consciousness. All right, the limbic system is not the reward center. The limbic system deals with emotions and also memories, like the hippocampus is a part of the limbic system. Think more lizard brain. Huh? Oh no, that's fine, I understand. 3, someone put morphine. Right? And is that the drug? Well, technically, yeah, because morphine is an opioid. Okay, an opioid. That means that it is a painkiller. So for number 3, what drug mimics endorphins? That would be opioids. What neurotransmitter mimics endorphins, though? Okay, Joe answered correctly in the chat that number 1 is the nucleus accumbens. The nucleus accumbens is the reward system. It's where dopamine hits. Okay, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that mimics endorphins. Okay, because it can help with relieving pain. You have a higher pain threshold if you have a lot of dopamine. Okay, so number 1 is nucleus accumbens. Number 2, someone said the bottom up takes a general situation and uses deductive reasoning to come to a more specific conclusion using your senses. So sensory information like your sight or hearing. Whereas top down reasoning starts out with specific instance or experience and then uses inductive reasoning to find the broader situation. So bottom up is sensory. You start with only what you can hear, see, taste, feel, whatever. Top down is you already have an experience. You already have an idea of what the answer might be. So if you're looking at scrambled letters and you can read words out of it, that is top down. Okay, so we've got number 1 with nucleus accumbens. We've got number 2 with bottom up being sensory and top down being based on ideas or schema or prior knowledge based. 3 is dopamine and opioids. 4 is not Alfred Adler. I'll give you a hint. His first name is Edward. He was on your very first test where you had to do the index cards for the people in history and psychology. And number 5, his name starts with William. Yeah.
Number 4, I don't remember his last name. I just remember his start.
Okay, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. Number 4, I meant to put Edward. Yeah, good. Number 5 is William James. Okay, and 4 is Edward Titchener. Good. So 4 is Edward Titchener. 5 is William James. Remember that William James was the American psychologist that popularized psychology in the United States. Titchener is just a fun word to say. It just hits different. Okay, so this would be a nice review just for the units that we've covered so far. Are we good so far? All right, now we've already covered this. All right, so structure and the function of long-term memory. What is long-term memory? How many different types do we have? Well, we have explicit versus implicit. Remember that explicit is declarative. It is conscious. It requires conscious effort. Like you have to declare semantic memory. Okay, semantic means meaning. So your understanding of language, general facts like who is the first president, who's the last president, and so on, versus episodic memory, which deals with episodes in your life, personal experiences. So long-term memory is broken down into 2 parts, declarative versus non-declarative, explicit versus implicit. And this is also known as procedural. So like muscle memory. And declarative is broken down into 2, semantic versus episodic. Okay, the implicit memory is muscle memory. So motor skills, operant conditioning, classical conditioning from Unit 4, all of that follows under implicit because you don't have to declare how to ride a bike. Okay, you simply do it, or how to tie your shoes, you simply do it. Now, are there any limits to long-term memory? Is there displacement? Right, there are no limits to long-term memory. It is potentially limitless. It's just you have to keep encoding and keep rehearsing. Okay, so if you forget something that had been in your long-term memory, that can be due to retrograde amnesia, or it could damage for anterior grade amnesia, which prevents you from forming new memories. But a healthy long-term memory is potentially lifelong and potentially limitless. It's not like an attic that you have to clear out with a yard sale every once in a while to make room for more information. That's your short-term memory, which has a digit span of 7 plus or minus 2, according to George Miller. Okay, so when we talk about amnesia, in addition to blunt force trauma or tumors that can occur damage to your memory, there's also Alzheimer's disease. And there's different stages to Alzheimer's disease. In the early stages, one of the first symptoms is partial loss of semantic memory. Semantic meaning meaningful memory. So if you ask somebody, what month is it? Or what happened on December 7th, 1941. Okay, they might partially forget most of that information due to the spread of the disease. Then you have the middle stages where their short-term memory, in addition to their long-term memory, starts being affected. So they may forget where they are. They may forget who they're talking to. Okay, so you may have some symptoms of Alzheimer's where someone who is suffering from the disease, they're talking to somebody and they mistake them for their spouse, or they mistake them for a sibling who's already passed away. And then the later stages, that's when you get the more severe symptoms where their long-term memory is severely impaired. And so they start losing touch more and more with reality. So what causes Alzheimer's disease? Well, there is some evidence that certain proteins in the brain start accumulating, and that prevents the synapses from being able to send messages. So like here you see with this brain scan, this PET or PET scan, done of a normal brain, or a neurotypical brain, we should say, versus a person with Alzheimer's brain, you see that there's much more activity on the left compared to the right. So it's preventing the brain from functioning, hence the symptoms that we see with memory loss. Good so far? All right, so with those proteins, there's low amyloid and low tau protein. So with this, you have the normal adult or neurotypical adult on the far left, where you have a little bit of tau and amyloid. There's even some examples of neurotypical older adults, you see that the presence of those proteins increases. So as they get to higher levels, okay, here on the spectrum, that's when you start seeing symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And so this can be a predecessor, this can be a marker for whether or not someone is at risk for Alzheimer's disease, is by getting these PET scans and measuring the electrical activity in the brain. Are we good so far? All right, we're getting there, y'all. We're almost done. So parts of the brain used in memory. You need to know that the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the cerebellum, those are the main ones that we're going to talk about when we talk about the parts of the brain dealing in memory. Particularly long-term potentiation or long-term memory occurs with the hippocampus, which is in the limbic system, and as well as the amygdala. Remember that the amygdala is responsible for our emotional reactions, okay, as well as our social and sexual behavior. Remember that emotions can more strongly imprint memories, like with flashbulb memories from episodic memories from long-term memory. Okay, consolidation is when the first step of memory, the working memory, is eventually encoded and moved over into long-term memory. So consolidation is simply the movement of information from the non-permanent storage into permanent storage. Okay, so the stronger the emotions, the stronger the memories, and we can tie that back to the functioning of the amygdala. The basal ganglia, you don't really see a lot of in psychology, but we're just gonna go ahead and talk about it anyway. This is important for the retrieval of memory, so step 3 in the information processing model, as well as the formation of habits. Okay, so it could tie into classical conditioning as well. Lastly, the cerebellum. Okay, the cerebellum is the part of the base of the spine right here, or the base of the brain stem right here, that deals with movement and balance. So this means that the cerebellum would be important for implicit memory, non-declarative memory, procedural memory, knowing how to throw a ball, knowing how to ride a bike, knowing how to swim. That is based in your cerebellum, or your cerebellum is at least very important for that. Does anyone need this slide before we move on? Okay, I think we have about 2 more slides and then we'll be finished with the first half of Unit 5. Okay, so we're still in retrieval. We're still talking about implicit, which is procedural or muscle memory, versus explicit, which can include semantic and episodic. And so there are also some retrieval cues that we can use in order to recall this information more accurately. So think about using a search engine like DuckDuckGo or Google in order to remember something. So the more specific you are with those retrieval cues, the better the results are going to be. So when I said, Edward blank, okay, you might think, oh, I've associated Edward with Titchener because of what I've already learned in psychology. So the more specific I was, the more easily you are able to recall that information, as opposed to if I said his name starts with an E. Okay, there are a lot of names that start with an E, right? And so it would take you a little bit longer to get to the answer Edward Titchener than if I just started out with Edward, or if I even gave you Edward T. Okay. Some memories are more easily remembered. Maybe they've been rehearsed more, or they have more an emotional tie, where others may be more difficult to bring up. And that could be because of the lack of encoding, the lack of paying attention. Remember that the first step in encoding is you have to pay attention to something. So let's say you're working on your ID terms in your math class, right? And that's the day they go over the Pythagorean theorem. Well, if you're not paying attention to your teacher, they're going around like a squared plus b squared equals c squared and what have you, then you're going to completely miss that information, because you cannot encode it unless you pay attention. And also the way that you encode it matters. Okay, so if you're doing shallow processing, say for your ID terms, do I put the same definition word for word from the book in the quiz? No, if you remember from freshman year especially, I do not do that. I give you the definition, and it is the correct definition, but it is not exactly what was on the Quizlet or what was exactly in the book, because I don't want to test you on what you can memorize. I want to test you on what you can actually know and process and use to analyze. So if it's shallow processing, if I change the wording on that quiz for that definition, you may draw a blank. You may not remember what it was, as opposed to if I use the exact words and you just picked up on those key terms. Whereas if you use deep processing or AP processing, then you'd be able to recognize, okay, she used different words or she said this in a different way. Okay, but I can still figure out the answer. It's kind of like with the fact that we don't have a lockdown browser with these tests. Like, I don't give y'all questions, or at least I don't give my AP World kids questions that can be found on the internet. Because I know, like, if they just copy and paste the question, it'll take them to a Quizlet, dozens of Quizlets where people have already found the answer and everything, right? And so instead, I spend hours changing the words. I find synonyms in order to like change it from like Native American to indigenous, because then if they Google it word for word in the Google search, it'll just come up with a Wikipedia page on the indigenous peoples. It won't come up with that specific AP question that someone posted from the College Board. Okay, so by doing that, okay, I've been able to prevent some academic dishonesty as best as we can. Okay, last slide for today. The blocking of retrieval. How do we not remember things that we're trying to remember? So blocking can be conscious or unconscious, like if it is suppression, where you're trying to suppress a unfortunate memory, that can be conscious, versus if you are accidentally or unconsciously repressing information. So blocking is forgetting a memory or not being able to retrieve that memory at the time due to interference. So it doesn't mean that information's gone forever, right? It's not amnesia. It just means you can't remember it at that moment when you want to. Okay, proactive interference is when a past memory disrupts a new memory. Okay, so if you're used to putting away your dishes in certain drawers at your old house, but then you move and the kitchen layout's different and the drawer layout is different, then you got to remember, okay, which cabinet do I put the cups in? Where do I put the forks and what have you? Or in terms of learning a second language, there's a lot of proactive interference with that. For instance, I'm a native English speaker, but I spent a few years learning Spanish. So when I came across this word, embarazada, in my studies, right? I already had an old memory. Okay, I had the English word, the cognate, embarrassed. There are a lot of false cognates in Spanish where it's like, oh, familia, family, they're pretty much the same word. Okay, but then you have some false cognates where actually it means something completely different, right? So I have an old memory of the word embarrassing that is interfering with me remembering the word embarazada in Spanish. Now, what does this word actually mean? Does anyone know off the top of their head? Pregnant, good. So yeah, definitely not embarrassed. So I have this old memory interfering with the learning of this new word. Or if you're trying to learn Korean, right? In Korean, ne means yes. But to a native English speaker, okay, ne sounds a lot like na or no. Okay, so you might confuse, oh, ne is yes with ne is no, and then you're, messing up your speaking of the Korean language. Okay, retroactive memory is when a new memory blocks an old memory. Remember that retro means old, so an old memory is being blocked. Okay, so if you're driving an automatic car after driving a manual, the new memory of driving an automatic may block you remembering how to drive a manual. Or if you've ever gotten a new phone, okay, and then you broke it. Like, let's say your screen cracked on your new iPhone. What's the newest one? 12. And so you had to go into your drawer and rummage out your old iPhone 7. Okay, well, you've already gotten used to the iPhone 12. So you may forget how to get rid of apps on the iPhone 7. That's an example of retroactive memory. You have a new memory, your new phone, blocking memory of how to use the old phone. Like right now, do I know how to text using numbers on a flip phone? No, I've forgotten how to do that. When I was y'all's age, though, I was an expert at it. But now I've learned how to text using my new phone, a smartphone, And so that old information is, no longer used. Or if you've ever had to learn locker combinations, okay, every year you get a new locker combination. How many of you have ever tried to put in your new locker combination and you put in an old one? Okay, that's proactive. An old memory, the previous year's locker code, is blocking out your new locker code. Okay, or in a new memory blocks retrieval of an old memory. Let's say you're trying to remember an old password that you had to recover your account. Okay, that could be yet another example. So it's really easy to mix these two up. So it's imperative that you find some sort of mnemonic device or some sort of retrieval cue to help you remember the difference between proactive, which is old disrupting new, versus retroactive, which is new blocking old. Does that make sense? All right, when we get back on Thursday, that is y'all's test, multiple choice and FRQ. And then you're working asynchronously for the rest of the class. And then when we return on Monday, we're going to move on to the second half of Unit 5, which is thinking and language. So how do we think, and how does our environment and language and upbringing affect the way that we think?